Many people know Osamu Tezuka for his family-friendly anime and manga. He's known as the godfather of manga, and that's not without good reason. Tezuka prided himself on being at the cutting edge of his industry, and he was always looking for new ways to create and innovate. He would tackle mature storylines in Astro Boy and Kimba, while still keeping things relatively easy for children to comprehend and enjoy. He even went so far as to found Mushi Production, the anime studio responsible for some of the earliest adaptations of Tezuka's manga. The 1952 Astro Boy series would set the foundation for how Japan would animate and produce TV shows. And Mushi would only rise in popularity with each adaptation of Tezuka's work. But he could feel a change in the wind. His assistant, Shotaro Ishinomori, was writing darker material, which in turn Mushi would end up collaborating on. So in response to this growing trend, Tezuka began drawing edgier manga that would be turned into edgier anime series. But he didn't want to get left behind in the medium that was maturing around him. In fact, he wanted to be the catalyst that would make anime and manga into a medium for adults. But this is not just Tezuka's story. This is also the story of Eiichi Yamamoto, Tezuka's assistant, who followed him down the journey of maturing the anime industry, and would ultimately be left holding the bag when Tezuka gave up. Yamamoto would direct 3 feature-length adult animated films. These were known as Mushi Productions' Anime-Rama Trilogy. Before we can really go into these films, it is important to establish where Anime-Rama came from. Anime-Rama stands for anime and drama. That was really more on the nose than I expected.
作ってる途中でヘラルドからアニメラマっていうふうに名前を付けたいんだって。なんだその語源を言って何なんだって聞いたらアニメーションのドラマだからって言って先生で笑っちゃいましてねあんまりにもいい日なんでそれでアニメーションのドラマだからアニメラマなんですよね。
This name was mostly chosen for distribution and release of these films rather than any sort of creative decision. Mushi Productions would expand their staff for the Anime-Rama project, but even for experienced staff, making a film posed a new set of challenges. The aforementioned Eiichi Yamamoto was brought on as 1001 Nights director, despite the fact that this was his first completely original feature film, as in not a compilation films of episodes that he had done prior. But Tezuka clearly trusted him with it. Yamamoto had worked on plenty of his adaptations before, directing episodes of the original Astro Boy and serving as a series director on Kimba the White Lion. Being a fan of Disney films, Tezuka's goal was to use the Anime-Rama project as a way of breaking into the international film scene. So with that in mind, Mushi Productions wanted to have a story that had international appeal.
最初はファーストをやるつもりだったんですよ。ファーストをやろうと思って、それで原作なんかを読んだりしたんですけども、エリザベス・テイラーとリチャード・パートンのファースタス博士っていう映画が来たんですよ。ファースタス博士が来ちゃったんだから、これは僕ファーストやったら2番煎じになってしまうっていうんで、やめまして、それで何がいいかって時に、その頃、どこだったか忘れましたけど、その千円者物語っていうのは続々と出版されてたんですよね。で、千円者物語がいいんじゃないかって言って、
The Arabian Nights was already internationally known and retold in countless numbers of cultures. It seemed like the perfect choice for what Mushi wanted. It also helped that these stories themselves were simple enough. Tezuka and Yamamoto could easily make any changes that they wanted to, and so the script was plotted out, but that also had its own set of challenges. Tezuka had many big ideas for the film, but was struggling to fill in the details. The script ended up changing hands a few times, including some edits by Yamamoto himself before it was finalized.
で、手塚さんに見せたら、それで OK だって。で、僕が絵根性を描くからって。手塚さんが絵根性を描いたんですよ。で、そしたら長いんですよね。
The story of 1001 Nights centers on Aladdin, a moneyless drifter who discovers the love of his life, Miriam, at a slave auction in Baghdad. However, after a series of unfortunate circumstances involving thieving bandits and the scheming chief of police, Bali, Aladdin is framed for murder. But before he can be reunited with Miriam, she dies, leaving Aladdin once more to drift off into a series of adventures only to return to Baghdad as the mysterious and wealthy Sinbad the Sailor. Using his newfound power and influence, Aladdin becomes the new king of Baghdad, only to have it all crumble around him in the end. That's much more summary than I usually give, but that's also leaving out so much of the interwoven subplots. Because you see, 1001 Nights feels like it was made by a committee in the best of ways. Without being a complete mess, the film had become a mixing pot of many unique animators with their own ideas. Future legends like Osamu Dezaki worked on this before going on to have their own distinct style of animation. The film employs a variety of styles and techniques. Sometimes it's mixed with live action, other times it's split screen. And then there's times where the animation is just supposed to represent what's going on in the story. And by that I mean the animated sex scenes are as artsy as possible. There's a heavy erotic element to the art direction in 1001 Nights, and of course it was intentional. But those looking for stereotypical Japanese hentai are going to be disappointed. The sex is less pornographic and more artistic. It might not always be completely vanilla, or if I'm being honest, completely tasteful, but the erotic elements are more to brand the film as adult animation than anything else.
全部映画が出来上がってからスウェーデンのね、大使館の人がいまして素晴らしいって言うんですよね。あのシーンが素晴らしいって言うんですよ。で、スウェーデンの人がセックスシーンを見て素晴らしいって言うからにはきっと絶対素晴らしいんだろうと思ったんですよ。
That being said, the film does tackle a lot of dark subject matter. Of course, it does this with Tezuka's character designs, which I've always been a big fan of. The sort of disconnect between a mature story and cartoony characters is actually something that gives the movie a unique style and atmosphere to it. And it's something that Tezuka really excels at in general. While I have to admit that 1001 Nights is not the most focused film I've seen, I do think it was a smart decision to center it on a character like Aladdin. Aladdin is the story's anchor around which characters with their own stories come in and out of.
お前のことは忘れねえから気をつけて帰れよ。ハルリンのバッカ野郎。
And the character himself gets a great deal of development. He starts very sympathetic, being a hopeless romantic with no money, only to go crazy with power by the film's third act. But when that shift does happen, it's easy to understand why. At that point, even though Aladdin makes some horrible decisions, you can still understand why he's doing these things.
なんだいこれが王様ってもんか。俺だって人並みにな恋もしたけりゃ愛されもしたいんだよ。一人ぐらい俺と心を通わせてくれたっていいじゃないか。金も男もあるもんか。金やるか金やるかちよ
But the story also appeals to me because my favorite book is also about an escaped prisoner returning to his homeland disguised as the wealthy Sinbad the Sailor. I don't know if it was intentional, but that's what this had always reminded me of. In 1001 Nights, every scene is just a little longer than it really should be, which I don't really mind because I vibed with this film from the start, but I have shown it to some people and they did not have the same experience with it. The film begins to meander in the middle sections, and that's mainly because this part is pretty aimless. It doesn't help that the new characters in the third act range from not very interesting to annoying. Like, did we need a whole subplot about these two genies just to justify Tezuka's transformation fetish?
みんな暮らしどっか行っちゃいたいねえだと
There are going to be a lot of people, like me, that enjoyed this film from the first frame, but I can also understand if somebody ended up finding certain scenes a little bit too boring or a little bit too self-indulgent. Either way, it packs a lot into its 2-hour runtime, letting you get wrapped up in the world of the film, and it's clearly a labor of love. And I think for that alone, it's worth checking out.
そうするともうテレビのアニメーションっていうのは早い話が育つなわけですよ。たまにもっと複雑に動かす、好きなだけ動かしていいんだっていうアニメーションをやりますとね、みんなそれすごい入れ込んじゃうわけですよね。だから千円焼き物語っていうのはみんなが入れ込んでるんで。
Upon release in Japan, 1001 Nights was a critical and financial success, which, for an animated film that was the first of its kind, is extremely good.
日本ではね、すごい人気だったんですよ。この千円焼き物語はその年の栄光の2000マイルっていう映画があって、で、まあそれが上でしたけど。大体3位ぐらい、興行成績が3位ぐらいなんです。
However, overseas, it didn't seem to fare quite well as Tezuka would have wanted. In fact, the English dub for this film has actually become lost media.
Why don't we just resort to force to one of our usual tricks, and that way we can get rid of our old friend Charlemagne, something that would be to the advantage of you as well as myself.
Badly ambitious and conniving government official.
But in any case, it looked like Anime Rama was being set off on the right track, and Mushi Production was ready to start their follow-up film, scheduled to be released the very next year. While the Anime Rama project was produced and attached to Tezuka's name, 1001 Nights had strayed very far from him creatively. In an effort to reattach Tezuka to the project, Yamamoto handed the reins of Cleopatra over to him.
監督じゃなくていいですから、仕事は手伝いますから、手塚さんが自分で思うようなものを作ってほしいって言ったんですよ。そしたら手塚さんもそれ分かってくれて、僕がやるよって言って。
As a result, the film has much more of Tezuka's involvement and much less restraint put on it. The story of Cleopatra begins where everyone would expect it to: outer space. After some terrifying rotoscoping over live-action footage, 3 of these nightmares decide to Assassin's Creed their minds into the past in order to learn about the sinister Cleopatra plan that aliens are planning to enact. Something I don't really know, and neither does the plot. We're less than 10 minutes in, and there's already several problems here. But the question is why? Why is there even a wraparound story? Why are the credits this overly long sci-fi sequence that has nothing to do with the movie? Why is it live action? Why? Well, most people working on Cleopatra were actually just as baffled.
始めたのが最初の最初でっていうか最初と最後にある実写なんですね。見てたもんじゃなかったんです。
And we'll get to that more later. First, let's talk about what the movie is actually about. That being the title character herself.
あっと驚くためごろか何
The majority is about Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar, a man whom she loves, but also has to assassinate. And that's about 60% of the movie. To keep things interesting, she does sleep with Caesar a lot in this part of the film, so I guess that makes up for something. Still, the sex isn't porn, but in Cleopatra, it's not quite art either. Although it's portrayed through the same art house lens, the sex feels more gratuitous and less attached to the plot. And apparently, one frame was so explicit that it had to be removed from the film altogether.
カットされたカットっていうのはね、これ線書きなんです。これは女のお尻ですけどね。要するにこれ線で書いただけなんですよ。線で書いただけでですね、そんな何局部の形もないわけですね。にもかかわらずこれがエロチックだって言われてね。
The future people run around, not really affecting the plot in any meaningful way, and Cleopatra goes back and forth on whether or not she'll actually assassinate Caesar, making most of the film feel like it's killing time until they, well...
Brutus, お前もか。
I actually completely, unironically like Caesar's death scene. I think it's one of the few things that the film does well, and it's fascinating to see a pivotal moment in Western history portrayed in kabuki theater. But therein lies the problem with Cleopatra, that being history. Despite having no claim to historical accuracy, in fact, it even goes so far as to say it is not accurate, the story just kinda strings you along until it gets to certain key historical events, after which the plot takes off, sort of. I mean, things happen, but it has no real goal. 1001 Nights took us on a journey from point A to B back to A again, but the entire time, the audience had some sort of expectation of what was going to happen. Oh no, Aladdin's mad with power. How is this going to turn out? Here, because the plot is derived from history, there's much more of an expectation of, we know Julius Caesar is a historical figure. We know that he dies, and quite famously too. So it goes from point A, and stays at point A for a while, and stays at point A, until eventually point B comes in, and then it goes to C, D, E, and F. And by the time we reach that last point in the plot, the future people come back into the main story, when there's only 10 minutes left in the film. The ultimate revelation of what the Cleopatra plan is, the ultimate reason why we have the future plot in the first place, is that Cleopatra was a woman who seduced a man and planned to kill him. And that might be what aliens are planning on doing. Why am I even bothering with this? This is the last shot of the film. It's a bunch of meaningless text over a planet that we haven't seen before. There is no reason for this to be in the film, let alone end the film. In the anime Rama trilogy, I found Cleopatra to be the most goofy. Not that 1001 Nights didn't haphazardly swing between goofy and dramatic, but Cleopatra seemed to be goofy even in scenes where it wanted to be taken seriously. Moments that should be tense are broken by cameos that make absolutely no sense. Again, why were these in here, Tezuka? These questions that I'm asking are actually the same questions that Mushi Production asked themselves.
クレオパトラっていうのは鉄の跡が突然出てきたりね、ワンショットずつ入ってくる、他の作品が入ってくる。 そういうアイデアはいいんですけども、だからってどこが面白いのってね。
The only person they didn't ask was Tezuka. Now, being the co-director on the project, he did have a much stronger hold on it. But he was also the founder of Mushi, and that meant people didn't really want to tell him no. So they whispered around the office about how Cleopatra was going to flop, about how it was a mess. But Tezuka didn't pay attention to that. As always, his head was too busy buried in his work. He was so busy, in fact, that he failed to notice when the rights to 2 of his manga's anime adaptations were stolen right from under his nose. It's up for debate whether this was intentionally to spite Tezuka prioritizing Cleopatra, or if it was a legitimate mistake that left his name off of Triton of the Sea and Little Wanza, but Tezuka certainly saw it as the former. However, if Cleopatra was a hit, then it would have made up for every bit of inter-office sabotage. After all, this was a very ambitious film, but it wasn't a hit. Cleopatra was a financial and critical failure in Japan.
クレオパトラの方もそこまではいきませんでしたけども、5位か6位ぐらいは入ってると思います。
And when it went overseas under the international name of Cleopatra, Queen of Sex, it did even worse. Under that title, people were expecting sleaze. They were expecting a porno. And what they got was an aimless, goofy anime movie. So it is at this point that Tezuka leaves our story. To him, Mushi Production had become a bunch of yes men who would take any opportunity to stab him in the back. And to be fair to Mushi, Tezuka had become a disinterested and distant creator, who spent all of his time and resources on a project that was doomed to fail, instead of their consistently successful television adaptations. But before leaving Mushi Productions, Tezuka would greenlight one more film for Yamamoto to direct. Though neither of them knew it at the time, this film would be the third and final entry into Anime Rama.
美しい女ベラトナ恋をした女話の足音はまだ聞こえてこない
Belladonna of Sadness was never meant to be an Anime Rama film.
で売ってる時には悲しみのベラドンナっていうのをつけて3本出てますけども、ベラドンナと前のこの千夜千夜とクレオパトラとは全然違うんですよね。
That fact is made more readily apparent when you look at the trilogy as a whole. Belladonna has the shortest runtime. It lacks the humor that other entries had. And it is completely separated from Tezuka's involvement and his style. But yet, it might be the best of the trilogy. The film is about 2 lovers, Jean and Jeanne. They're a happy couple, and I hope nothing bad ever happens to them. The plot is set into motion after Jeanne is gang raped. From there, things only get worse for the couple until she makes a deal with the devil, making her into one of the most powerful and dangerous people in France. Belladonna of Sadness is a simple story told with the visual flair and style of a trippy 70s movie. Unlike the other 2 Anime Rama films, it doesn't branch out into the subplots and side characters. Instead, it's more akin to a fairy tale. This fairy tale is accompanied by a funky 70s soundtrack, compliments of jazz musician Masahiko Sato. The soundtrack nearly turns the film into a musical without actually having the characters sing. It also helps to guide the story along, transitioning scenes smoothly and keeping the plot at an easy to understand level.
それとも女の重たい
which while the setting and characters are deceptively simple, they can easily be applied to many different allegories. Jeanne can be seen as an analog for a woman's struggle against abuse, just as much as it is a parallel to women defying societal norms. This is rooted in Belladonna's inspirations, namely the 1862 book Satanism and Witchcraft, or as it is known in French, La Sorcière. Known for being one of the first books to portray witches favorably, the film looks at them in very much the same way. Jeanne's deal with the devil is more a representation of her finally releasing herself. It's more about her taking charge of her own life for once. And this only becomes more apparent once the film draws its parallels to the French Revolution at the very end. Now, I have no way of confirming this, but I can't help but wonder if the original idea of adapting Faust that started before 1001 Nights worked its way into Belladonna, with the film being based off of a different Western novel and including a deal with the devil. It would make all too much sense.
私は恐ろしい女になりたい。誰もが顔を背けて逃げ出すような、そうでなければいけないの。私は怒りや憎しみを忘れたくないの。
怒りが憎しみが恨みが醜いものだと誰が決めた。お前は美しくなったのだ、ジャンヌ。
The tone and subject matter of Belladonna is much more in line with the Japanese New Wave film movement. Taken from the French New Wave, this movement would include some of Japan's most artsy art films, and the genre had a similar through line of erotic and depressing stories. With Belladonna's French inspiration and its erotic subject matter, the film fits snugly into this movement, even if it was released at the tail end of the Japanese New Wave. But speaking of eroticism, in Belladonna, it is the most prevalent it has ever been in the anime-rama trilogy. The film blends sex into the narrative and themes to the point where it is inseparable. You could argue that you could take most of these sex scenes out of 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, but Belladonna would not be the same without it. While doing all but outright preaching it, it's a very 70s free love movie. Of course, in the end, things don't turn out so well for our protagonists, but the theme is there. Some might call it misery porn, some might just call it porn, but either way, the film is gorgeous. It's depressing, brutal, and beautiful, all at the same time. What the film lacks in animation, it makes up for in extremely detailed and lovingly painted images. Of course, that's selling short some of the extremely well animated and very experimental sequences that are in the film. Much like 1001 Nights, Belladonna feels like a collection of animators all doing their thing all at the same time, and once again, it doesn't feel like a complete mess. And I think the linchpin that holds it all together is Yamamoto. He's not an auteur director. There's no style or themes that he's known for. In fact, you could argue that both were handed down to him by Tezuka and by his producers. From his interviews, I think it was clear that Yamamoto was interested in the anime-rama project on a technical level rather than a thematic one. He wanted to push the boundaries of how animation was made in new and interesting ways. And I think the reason that Belladonna holds together so much more than the other two entries is that the shadow of Tezuka is no longer behind him. While it's clear that Yamamoto was inspired by Tezuka's work ethic, unlike the films with Tezuka's involvement, Belladonna never got hung up on the big ideas. It never got lost trying to do too much all at once. This could also be because there was less expectation put onto it.
アニメラマっていうのが大作路線だとしたら中作路線っていうか
Unlike the other films, Belladonna was never supposed to be a big blockbuster hit. It was always supposed to be art house. And because it was always meant to be art house, meant that Belladonna never had a wide theater release like the other two anime-rama films had. This also meant that when Belladonna was released, it was a certified flop. The very same year, Mushi Production would officially declare bankruptcy. While it would return some years later, it would be under a completely new staff. All the old Mushi members had gone off to found new studios, and it would seem that the anime-rama project as a whole was deemed a failure. The folly of anime-rama was simple. It was too early. In Japan, the animation industry was only just starting to mature, but overseas, the idea of mainstream adult animation was still very far off. Advertising for both 1001 Nights and Cleopatra wanted to focus on the adult aspects of these films, but that really wasn't what these films were about. Yes, they were there, but it was never the focus of either of those films. In fact, in Japan, these films were also advertised to fans of Astro Boy because of Tezuka and Mushi's involvement.
宣伝文句がね、鉄のアトムからグローブ千円茶物語へっていう、鉄のアトムから悲しみのベランダへって言うんですよ。で、これはね、いい文句のようで、僕は全然ダメだと思ったんです。
Overseas, these were art films that were advertising themselves as porn, except for the case of Belladonna, which didn't see a Western release until much, much later. Now, 50 years later, Belladonna is probably the best received and most well known because it managed to find its audience among the art house crowd. Ironically, when the film was released, there was an audience for adult animation, but it wasn't as mainstream as Mushi would have wanted. Fritz the Cat was released a year before Belladonna, and there was a growing crowd of people who would have been interested in the psychedelic drug trip that is Belladonna. But far too many years too late, Belladonna finally had its limited American theatrical run. In fact, it was only a few years ago when the Blu-ray came out. And yes, I did go to see it in theaters, and yes, the rape scene was awkward to see among a crowd full of people there expecting it to be some sort of silly Japanese movie. But the story doesn't end here for Tezuka and Yamamoto. The seal of adult animation was broken, and the medium had already begun to mature, but not through film. In 1974, Eiichi Yamamoto would become one of the lead episode writers on a television show called Space Battleship Yamato. While being a widely popular series, Yamato also took its subject matter very seriously and delivered impactful and mature messages. It also featured a blue-skinned Roman-esque character, so make of that what you will. So while Eiichi didn't, and still doesn't, receive enough recognition for his trilogy, he would go on to help build the foundation for mature storytelling in anime as we know it.
民営的なアニメーションなんて考えてみれば簡単なんですよ。誰も考えつかないことやればいいだけですから、考えつかないことを考えつけばもう締めたものなんですけど、普通のアニメーションの作り方で普通に面白い。
And Tezuka, while not drawing his focus away from anime entirely, would begin a new chapter in his career. It would be marked by much darker storytelling across several manga series that one could only describe as edgy.